So our first keynote is Dr. Jerry Heindel. Jerry Heindel has a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Michigan and has worked in the area of reproductive biology and toxicology while on the faculty of the University of Texas Medical School at Houston and the University of Mississippi before coming to the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, NIEHS, in Research Triangle, North Carolina, to head their reproductive and developmental toxicology group. 15 years ago, he moved to the Division of Extramural Research and Training at NIEHS, where he is a scientific program administrator and responsible for developing and administering the NIEH grants program in endocrine disruptors, developmental basis of disease, reproductive toxicology, and obesity diabetes. He is also the coordinator for the virtual consortium of researchers studying the effects of bisphenol A. He has given over 80 invited lectures on these topics. Dr. Heindel's talk this morning is entitled Developmental Origins of Obesity, a Focus on Prevention. Please welcome Dr. Heindel.
Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction. It's terrific to be here today. So as you heard, I'm from NIEHS, and we're one of the biggest funders of research in the area of environmental chemicals and diseases and dysfunctions. But while we support the research, we have very limited capabilities to help get the word out, per se. So that's where you all come in, and I want to tell you on behalf of NIEHS how much we appreciate each of you and all of your different organizations and all the work that you do to help take the research that we fund and the findings and bring them out to the public to help really have an impact on human health. Today we're going to talk on one specific aspect, and that is obesity and the role of environment in causing obesity. So I'm going to start out back a little bit talking in general about the developmental origins of disease, then go into obesity and end up with some policy implications. So the question is, when do diseases actually start? And what causes diseases, just in general? So we know genetics plays a role, but it's not just genetics. We know today that all complex diseases consist of both genetics and an environmental component. Sometimes the environmental component might be quite small, it's 5% or something. But in other cases, it could be 50, 60%. But there's something there for the environment all the time. So then, when do diseases start? So if a woman goes to the doctor and is diagnosed with breast cancer at age 45, when did that breast cancer actually start? We used to try to link environmental chemicals at age 40 to breast cancer at age 45, and we never could get a good linkage there. We now realize we were looking at the wrong time, so that the timing is really critical, and that diseases start a long time prior. And actually, David Barker was the one who started this whole field, and it was initially called the Barker hypothesis. And what he did, he looked at people who were in the concentration camps and during the Nazis, and looked at birth weight from these women who were under severe malnutrition during pregnancy. And of course they had low birth weight. Then he looked over the lifetime and found that that low birth weight, because of poor nutrition during pregnancy, resulted in a 4-fold increase in heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and more recently now, obesity. So those diseases actually started in utero, and that was called the fetal origins of adult disease. Now over the years, the name has changed because it's not just adult disease, it's any disease, and it's not just in utero, but it's developmental time period, the time when specific tissues are developing. Turns out that time is the specific sensitive time. So now it's called more developmental origins of disease, or sometimes actually called the developmental origins of health and disease. And what that says then is that during development, the whole system is very sensitive to perturbation. So stress, poor nutrition, as I just mentioned, environmental chemicals, infections, and drugs can perturb the development. And it's called functional changes, or altering the programming of development. And it really is that different proteins get made, and sometimes even numbers of cells are different in tissues. But except for the severe malnutrition at birth, everything looks the same. Everything is normal. There's no indication that there's any disease going on there. But these alterations that started during development persist throughout life, and therefore increase the susceptibility to disease later in life. So we call that a bad start lasts a lifetime. So it's gestational or early childhood exposure to chemicals or poor nutrition, stress, that then lead to diseases, and the diseases show up later in life, even like neurodegenerative diseases, but they started way back there. So we think it's plausible and probably possible and likely that all non-infectious diseases have their origins during development, and we're working to try to prove that. So here's the really important slide. So take a look at the diseases on this slide and ask yourself, are these the biggest, most important diseases in human health today? Are these the diseases that are increasing at a tremendous rate and have been increasing for the last 20, 30, 40 years? And the answer, of course, is yes. Breast and prostate cancer, infertility, diabetes, obesity, early puberty, asthma, heart disease, learning disabilities, neurodegenerative diseases. So every disease shown here, we can show in an animal model by giving an environmental chemical at very low environmentally relevant doses just for a few days during development. Then the chemical is long gone, and later in life, all of these diseases will show up. And this is just a listing of a couple of different chemicals that can cause to show. So in red, I've indicated which ones we now know also work in the humans. You can imagine that this is complicated to do in humans. You have to have a birth cohort. You have to measure the environmental chemicals during pregnancy in the mother, and then try to link those chemicals to a disease later in life. So if you want to link it to neurodegenerative disease, you might have to follow them for 60, 70 years. So because this is a new field, what we're doing here is looking at the early childhood diseases of asthma, learning disabilities, obesity, and puberty. But certainly this will be expanded over the next years. So if you're following, you all should be asking the same question. How can this be? So we've known in toxicology for 40 years, if you take an adult, human or animal, and you expose it to a chemical, they can have toxic effects, but you take the chemical away, the toxic effects are gone. But here, you give the chemical just for a few days, you take the chemical away, and the toxic effects remain throughout life. How can that be? And we now realize how that occurs. And this is a new paradigm shift in toxicology, and it has to do with the importance of epigenetics. So this is the chromosome and the DNA. And sometimes there are chemicals that cause mutations in the DNA. They affect the actual backbone here. And those can cause toxicity. But most of the chemicals we're going to talk about today don't do that. but they can modify the epigenetics. And epigenetics is modifications to the DNA or the proteins that surround the DNA that control whether that DNA can be expressed into proteins or not. So the DNA contains the message of all the genes, but the epigenetic system controls when and where those genes are turned on. And it turns out development, of course, is the critical time, because you're starting with one cell and it's dividing, and then it has to decide, now I'm going to make liver cells, and some are going to be kidney cells, and some are going to be lung cells. And it's this epigenetic system under the control of hormones that decides. So each then tissue, while it has the same genome, has different genes turned on to make that tissue. And that's controlled by this epigenetic system. And we're going to talk just quickly about two parts. So the DNA can be all squished up really tight. It's wound around these little balls, and therefore none of the genes in there can be expressed and made into proteins. And that's controlled by these side chains where you can put different chemical moieties on there and spread it out. So right here is a piece spread out. Here's one little ball. The other ball would be over here. So a piece is spread out, and then here you can see you can take the DNA to RNA to make a protein. So that's one way you can control. The second way is called DNA methylation. It's like these little popsicle sticks. This section here is where all the machinery that controls this transcription process sits down and starts transcribing the DNA into RNA. But if these little methylation is there, it can't sit down. So you don't get the proteins made. So it's a double system from the chromatin and methylation, and it's a very complex interacting system we're just starting to understand. But I think this gives you the kind of picture. So for this epigenetic system, the most critical time is when the tissues are forming. So during development, the heart's made way back here. So if you're going to have an environmental chemical affect heart programming, it would have to be right here. Out here, it won't have any effect. But see, the central nervous system, the immune, lungs, and reproductive system, it goes into postnatal, sometimes up through puberty. So some of these systems have a long window that extends beyond in utero. So here's how I see it. You have a normal stem cell that's deciding what it should be, and then hormones are controlling this process, and different genes get turned on, and you get your normal growth and development. But if you have chemicals that can interfere with this hormonal system, then different genes get turned on, because there's different concentrations of hormones, or the hormones are there at the wrong time, and the system gets disrupted. And then this controls the proteins. Then for the rest of your life, you have this altered pattern and susceptibility to disease. So the way I like to look at it is this. So how many of you all have gone to the doctor and had your blood measured to look for liver enzymes? Anybody? Yeah. So when you come back and you say, oh, your liver enzymes are up, they're very concerned about that. And they're going to do something and then say, well, come back in 2 months and we're going to be sure your liver enzymes are okay. Well, if this process is occurring and you have chemicals that are disturbing this process, it's likely your liver enzymes are up at birth and they're going to stay up all your life and there's nothing you can do about it. So you can see how then that sets you up for susceptibility to disease. So when you have different diseases, each one of us in this room has a different susceptibility to getting diseases. People like to focus on genetics and say it's all genetics. All the money is actually going in genetics. But it's actually a small part that's due to genetics. A lot is due to the epigenetics, which is telling you which genes are turned on, and the fact that all these environmental factors during development can alter the epigenetics, alter the programming, and that's why each one of us is different from each other, not just genetics, but also epigenetics. And so this is gene, and epigenetics is really the environmental aspect. Okay, with that as a background, let's turn now to obesity. So I don't have to spend much time on this. Everybody knows this is a huge epidemic. Look at the change from 1990 in the United States with this blue being at 10%. 10 years later, now we're at 20%. 10 years later, now we're at over 30% of people in the United States being overweight or obese. It's a huge change in such a short time. So why do we really care about that? Well, we care about that because it causes diseases. There are some people who can be overweight and be quite healthy, but 80% will be unhealthy and have the possibility of all these different diseases. So we care because of the health risk, also the health cost to the community, and the social inequity of these health risks that shows up. So why is it that some people become overweight and obese? We all live in the same environment. We all had the same possibility for breakfast out there today, but 60 to 80% of us won't gain weight, and 20 to 40% will. So the answer is, of course, overeating and lack of exercise, and that's a huge role and plays a critical. But why is that? Why do some people overeat and exercise less than others? Maybe there's some underlying reason for that. Well, there's all kinds of things that cause obesity. One is genetic background. There are some diseases that cause weight gain. But this one I think is very important to us, in that there are drugs out there that are designed for a specific purpose, but have a side effect that they put on weight. Steroids, anti-diabetic drugs, antidepressants. You can do whatever you want, but if you're on those pills, they're going to put on 20, 30, 40 pounds, and that's it. There's viruses that put on weight. And then there's environment, and people say, okay, lack of sleep. Stress, of course, is probably important. I showed you nutrition is important. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about environmental chemicals. But we have such a hard time getting the message that an environmental chemical, a chemical made for some purpose, could have a side effect that could cause problems like obesity and diabetes. And I don't understand that, because here are these drugs that do the same thing. So where are we today? All the focus is really on genetics. But since this epidemic has occurred in the last 40 years or so, it can't be due to genetics. Genetics is underlying, but it hasn't changed in 40 years. Then the focus is all on treatment. Let's wait till everybody gets obese and then let's try to fix it with a drug. Well, we all know how that works. I don't know about you, but I've taken off the same 20 pounds 10 times over the last 40 years, 90% gain the weight back within a year. So these current approaches just aren't working. We need to look further. So it turns out there are really differences between people who gain weight and don't. There's differences in their food preferences. The ones that are obese tend to prefer high-fat foods. They have a higher desire and anticipation for food. They eat more in response to mood and emotional eating. They get a greater reward from eating. They have altered hormone levels related to controlling eating and how full they get. They'll even work harder to obtain food. And in general, there are people who have lower self-esteem. They're more impulsive and poor organizational skills. So there's a lot of things that separate people who gain weight more easily than others. So we're not clear if these are the cause of obesity or if they're an effect of obesity. But what we think could be the case, that they could be the result of altered programming by environmental chemicals that set up these differences so that it's easier to gain weight. So if you look at the gaining weight system, what controls appetite and satiety, there's two interacting factors. One is called homeostatic, and these are the hormones that go back and forth between your brain, your adipose tissue, your gut that tells you you're hungry, muscles, liver. And the other one, people don't pay much attention to, but there's a big section in the brain that controls your reward pathway. It signals your wantings and your cravings and basically can cause a food addiction if it's not set up right. And here we are today with all this easy access to high-fat, high-sugar food. And that really requires this reward pathway to be very strong. And it turns out it's the weakest link in what's going on here. So it's a very complicated system. It's an endocrine issue. This are all hormones that we're talking about here. Ghrelin tells you when you're hungry. Leptin tells you to stop eating. Insulin tells you to stop eating. There are hormones going back and forth between all the tissues controlling all of this. And it's all integrated in the brain that also controls this food addiction. And the same section of the brain also controls drug addiction. So there's a lot of similarities there. So does obesity start during development, and is it caused by environmental chemicals? Well, since we know this is an endocrine system, it makes perfect sense then that this is sensitive to chemicals that have endocrine disrupting activity. So it's highly logical and plausible. Secondly, we all carry a huge chemical body burden. Almost 300 different chemicals measured in women's cord blood. Sure, they're at low concentrations, but they shouldn't be there. And everybody has all kinds of different chemicals. And all of these chemicals really belong to the class called endocrine disrupting chemicals. Chemicals that disrupt the normal hormones of the endocrine system. So what we're proposing is that developmental chemical exposures can induce metabolic shifts that alter the regulation of energy balance and weight gain. It's a scale here of food intake and energy balance, and environmental chemicals during development, during this sensitive time period, will alter the programming. And while it's important to pay attention to food intake and exercise, I think that these chemicals are altering the set point for how much you can eat before you put on weight, how much you have to exercise to take off weight. So it's the underpinnings for controlling weight gain and how much you eat and how much it affects your weight. So here's the overall hypothesis, which is now called the Obesogen hypothesis. And I think it's the perfect storm. It starts out during development that there are environmental chemicals that have endocrine activity that will affect all these components of the control of weight gain. They can control this homeostatic pathway, the leptin, insulin, ghrelin that tells you you're hungry or you're full. They can control this reward pathway that tells you you want to eat it even when you're not hungry. They can control the number of fat cells, control energy expenditure, inflammation, which plays an important overriding role here, and can control stress and emotional responses to eating. All that occurs during development and can set you up, basically, Then throughout life, you really have continued stress on a system that was altered right from the start. So you have increased access to these high-fat, high-sugar foods in a system where this reward pathway is not very strong, and there's more fat cells, and the hormonal system is not working quite right. Now we all then, on top of that, have a lifestyle that's just not as full of exercise as it used to be. And in addition, we have continued exposure to these chemicals, not just during development, but through our entire life. So you can see how it builds on itself and is a perfect storm. So do we have any chemicals where this shows up? So here's really was the proof of principle 10 years ago. This is DES, diethylstilbestrol. Millions of women worldwide took this during pregnancy to prevent miscarriages. It didn't prevent a single miscarriage, but it ruined their offspring's lives. They're full of all kinds of diseases and problems, and now it's perfectly logical because it fits the developmental origins of disease. We put a strong hormone in during development that altered the programming of these offspring. But here's a case now where we took this DES in a mouse. It was only given for 5 days at a very low dose. And 9 months later, this is the DES mouse compared to its litter mate. Huge effect. And it looks like they're not eating anymore, but somehow their internal system was altered and they're putting on weight. Here's an example with bisphenol A. You're probably all familiar with that. That polycarbonate was in baby bottles and recently just got removed. And in water bottles, it lines all the cans of fruits and vegetables and sodas and things. And the BPA itself, the monomer leaches out and has estrogenic activity. And there are a lot of data now. I just picked one. This is a very small dose of 10 here. The government says 50 is safe. So they gave 10 to these animals. And after 9 months, this one weighed 676 grams compared to the control at 506. And there's now at least 5 or 6 separate labs around the world showing these same kinds of things. Here's another example. These are perfluorooctanoic acids. These are the things in Scotchgard and that keep your pizza from leaking into the container here. And same thing for popcorn and on the non-stick surfaces. And here's the same kind of thing. After a year or so of life, this huge weight gain. So some of these don't show up very early. It takes till adulthood before they show up. Some of these effects are gender specific, only appearing in males or females. Here's a nice example, tributyl tin, something you probably never heard of, but it's a fungicide used in a lot of high-value crops. And it's also in the white PVC tubing. And it's there in very high concentrations and constantly leaking out. And it causes weight gain both in males and females. You can see at 6 months here and 9 months. From developmental exposure to very low doses. And we actually know how this works. It takes the stem cells that could be fat cells or bone cells and makes them become fat cells. So you have less bone and more fat. There are now getting to be some nice human studies just to show you there's a lot of data on smoking. Over 25 smoking studies on humans. Every one shows that smoking during pregnancy will result in weight gain in the kids. There's phthalates and lots of other things. So we think this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are now around 20 chemicals and classes of chemicals that we can show in animal models that cause weight gain. So we don't know how many there are. We don't know the site and mechanism. We don't know how many might be affecting the reward pathways. But we know many are causing more fat cells, some are causing larger fat cells, and almost every one that causes weight gain is also causing diabetes and insulin problems. Whoops. We're working out the timing of exposures, and you know, what if there's a mixture? Since I told you we're exposed to hundreds, and here's 20 or so that do it, and we're exposed to every one of those. So what about the mixture of all of those and how important that effect might be? But this whole field is less than 10 years old, and we don't really know right now how big an impact this is really going to have on human populations of obesity. We're still working to try to get that data. But if this is true, it could have huge implications. It changes the focus from interventions once you already are overweight and obese. It changes the focus from genetics and drugs. It changes the focus to finally working on prevention. So we know the timing, it's during development. We know what causes it, environmental chemicals, poor nutrition, stress. So if we can improve, look at pregnancy, early childhood, and then puberty, reduce exposures, have better nutrition, we may be able to have a major impact to actually prevent these kinds of diseases. Currently, there's nobody really paying much attention to this. So would it be really worth it? So obesity costs a lot of money. 17% of all the US medical costs, they say now, is from obesity-related diseases. And if we took obese children at age 12 and they remain obese the rest of their life, they are costing the government $6 billion. And if we just had a 1% reduction, we could save almost 400 million. And what if we reduce that by 5%? That's almost 2 billion, or 10%, 4 billion. Pretty soon we're up into some money here. So, and it's not only the money we'd save, but the general health of the population and the emotional costs to the people and their families. So I think it really would be worth it. So the future is ours. We hold it in our hands, and we have the ability to make some changes. And I appreciate what all you are doing to help us to do that. So that's the end, but it's really the beginning of this brand new story. Thank you very much.